You know, when we picture 19th century exploration in Africa, what's the first thing that comes to mind? For most of us, it's probably this image of a lone, heroic European guy, map in hand, plunging into the unknown. But here's the thing. That picture, it's missing almost everyone. So today, we're going to pull back that curtain on the standard history book story and meet the real engines of these incredible journeys.
Check this out. This is a quote from Richard Burton, one of the most famous explorers of the era. He's exhausted at the end of a brutal march, and the one face he's thrilled to see isn't another European. It's his caravan leader, an African man named Sidi Bombay. And that one little sentence, well, it hints at a much, much bigger story, one that puts men like Bombay right at the heart of the action.
I mean, we can all name them, right? Burton, Speke, Livingstone, Stanley. Their names are all over the maps in the history books, but their expeditions were massive, just huge undertakings. So who were the hundreds of other people on these trips? The ones carrying all the gear, figuring out the terrain, and, crucially, negotiating safe passage.
Well, they were the caravan leaders, the kirongozi, they were the porters, the pagazi, who carried literally tons of supplies, and they were the armed guards, the Askari, who provided security for the whole group. These weren't just passive helpers, not at all. These were the professionals who made the whole enterprise of exploration even possible. They were, as one historian called them, the Dark Companions.
Okay, so let's actually meet some of these indispensable leaders. These weren't just guys who knew the way. These were seasoned pros with incredible careers that spanned decades and crossed the entire continent.
First up, you've got Sidi Bombay, who we just met. The man was an absolute legend, working with pretty much every major explorer looking for the source of the Nile. Then you have Chuma and Abdullah Susi, two names that are forever linked with David Livingstone. And Manua Sarah, a guy whose career as a guide and leader lasted almost 3 decades. I mean, these men had resumes that any explorer will be jealous of.
And this slide really gets at the complicated reality of these relationships. Look at how 2 different European leaders saw the same man. Captain Speke thought Bombay was witty and tireless. H.M. Stanley, on the other hand, saw him as honest but kind of slow. So you can see, these were not simple employer-employee dynamics. They were these really complex human relationships, filled with respect, frustration, and above all, total mutual dependence.
So, what did it actually take to be a caravan leader? Well, it was a masterclass in management and diplomacy. You had to be a negotiator, constantly striking deals with chiefs for safe passage. You had to be a logistics expert, responsible for hundreds of men and all their cargo. Of course, you had to be a guide in the truest sense of the word, and you had to be a diplomat, building trust with the powerful rulers whose lands you were trying to cross.
And that brings us to the journey itself. The day-to-day reality for everyone on these expeditions, well, it was a relentless grind. It was a constant battle for survival against the environment, against sickness, and against just pure exhaustion.
To really get a sense of how brutal these journeys were, just look at the numbers. On one of Burton and Speke's early trips, they started out with 25 donkeys. 25! That's what they needed to carry their huge load of equipment and all the goods for trading.
And after just a few months on the trail, they were down to one. One donkey. That incredible loss rate tells you everything you need to know about the conditions. Sickness, animal attacks, and just the sheer difficulty of the terrain were constant, daily threats.
And travel was never free. You couldn't just walk across these lands. A concept called hongo was absolutely central to every single journey. You can think of it as a toll or a tribute that you paid to a local ruler for the right to pass through their territory. And getting the hongo right was this super delicate diplomatic dance. If you paid too little, you could start a conflict. If you paid too much, you could bankrupt the entire expedition. It was a constant, high-stakes negotiation.
And the level of diplomacy that was needed was just extraordinary. At one point, on an expedition with a guy named Joseph Thompson, things got really tense and there was a serious threat of attack. So as headman, Chuma stepped in. He performed a ceremony of blood brotherhood with the local chief's son. This was a hugely significant act. It created a bond of kinship and guaranteed the caravan's safety. This wasn't just guiding, this was statecraft.
The list of daily dangers was just immense. You had diseases like smallpox that could just sweep through the caravan. Porters, pushed way past their limits, would often desert. Men and animals were always vulnerable to predators. And sometimes, the negotiations failed. On that same trip, Thompson's camp was raided one night by Kikuyu warriors, and sadly, 2 of his porters were killed. Every single day was a gamble.
But you know, out of all these stories of hardship and perseverance,
there is one journey that stands above all the others. It's a truly unbelievable story of loyalty that starts with the death of the most famous explorer of them all.
So, it's May 1873. David Livingstone dies deep in the interior of Africa, in what is now Zambia. His followers, led by Chuma and Susi, are now completely alone, thousands of miles from the coast. Now, they could have just buried him and gone home. Nobody would have blamed them. But instead, they made this extraordinary decision. They were going to carry their master home.
For almost 9 months, this small group of about 60 men and women carried Livingstone's preserved body, along with his precious journals and all his scientific instruments, on a journey of 1,500 miles. They had to navigate complex politics, fight off attacks, and push through just unimaginable hardship, all to honor their leader and make sure his life's work wasn't lost.
Horace Waller, the man who would eventually edit and publish those very journals, he put it perfectly. He said the task these men performed was truly Herculean. It was an act of devotion and endurance that just captured the imagination of the entire world and really cemented the legacy of men like Chuma and Susi. So, what does all this tell us? Well, it really forces us to completely rethink what an expedition even was, and maybe who the real heroes of these stories actually are.
Just look at this chart. It breaks down a typical large expedition. In this case, it was one led by a man named Verney Cameron. You've got 2 Europeans and over 200 Africans. This wasn't a European with a few helpers. This was an entire mobile community, a massive logistical operation, where the Europeans were a tiny minority and they were completely dependent on the skills, the labor, and the knowledge of their African companions.
And here's a crucial point. Their stories didn't just end after one big expedition. These men were professionals. After that incredible journey with Livingstone's body, Chuma and Susi became highly sought-after leaders for all sorts of other expeditions. Their careers continued, and their expertise was valued by anyone who wanted to travel safely in the interior. In the end, even the most hard-nosed explorers, they had to acknowledge their debt. H.M. Stanley, a guy who was not known for being sentimental, concluded the book about his journey across the continent by giving credit for its success to the willing hands and loyal hearts of his African crew.
Which really leaves us with a final question to think about. If exploration is fundamentally a team sport, one that relies on navigators, diplomats, logisticians, and laborers, then who really deserves to be called an explorer? Maybe that title doesn't just belong to the one man whose name is on the cover of the book, but to the entire team that made the journey possible in the first place.